presentation we want to do today is we're calling Walking the Talk, Application of Disability Culture to Speech Language Pathology. We just want to make sure everybody's clear and we understand the importance of considering disability when we're working in our professional context. I'm the lead presenter today. I'm Evelyn Hoagland. The picture I have on the slide shows a photo of me positioned at a slight left-facing angle. My hair is brown and chin length. I'm wearing a blue colored top and multicolored scarf. In the background is a brick wall and shrubbery. As I indicated on the first slide, I'm interested in making sure that we consider disability culture and disability in the context of what we're doing in our rehabilitative professions, specifically speech pathology. My co-presenter today is Elizabeth Salmons. The photo I have is a photo of her positioned at a slight right-facing angle. She has chin-length blonde hair and is wearing glasses with dark lenses and a pink, purple, and white geometric print top. In the background is a park setting.
Hello, everyone, and it's really an honor to be with you. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. And the reason I agreed to work on this with Dr. Hoagland is because I have been a recipient of various services throughout my life as a person who was born blind, and would like to just add a little perspective from that side. I've been truly blessed to have some wonderful people, as well as my family, some wonderful professionals working with me in my life. So thank you for doing what you're doing and being who you are.
Before we get started in our content, I want to make sure we declare that neither Elizabeth nor I have any relevant financial relationships to disclose. We're doing this because we want to share information and help each of us do our very best. The abstract for our presentation today, I'm just going to quickly read through, and that's as SLPs. We value language and understand the interplay between its usage and our underlying thoughts. When we use language based on the medical model, it risks objectifying the person under care. We will address implicit biases in language and encourage mindfulness to empower those we wish to help. The outcomes we want people to achieve today include that being able to identify aspects of history of disability culture, want to be able to identify examples of implicit bias in medically related language, and we want to be able to describe new ways to discuss processes related to our practice. All right, so getting into what we want to cover today, we want to start out by reviewing a little bit of history as it relates to disabilities. It's not hard for us to keep moving forward if we don't know where we were before where we are now. We need to know how we got here and what's been going on to this point. So as we consider where we came from, I want to make sure we consider some of the perspectives of society related to disability. A major part of what society has dealt with throughout time has been viewing people with disabilities as a burden on society. We look at that in a variety of different ways, but that's a common theme throughout all eras of history. We go through cycles. We see this changing over time. And one of the things we need to consider that this isn't just ancient history. This is also recent history and including our current lifetimes. So we see this, and if you look around you, you can see this going on even now. We just change focus and change emphasis, degree of burden. One of the ways we look at this is in times in history, people with disabilities have been relegated to the care of their families in the home. Sometimes this means they're not allowed out of the home. They were kept out of sight. It also had some issues related to any aspects of family, whether they participated in family activities and responsibilities or not, whether it was manual labor, whether how they were just perceived. Elizabeth, feel free to jump in at any point if you're interested, if you have something to share.
Absolutely. You know, when we talk about that historical perspective and bringing it a little closer to the present, I worked in a state vocational rehabilitation agency until 2018, and I was liaison with a nationwide nonprofit. And they did a survey, and one of the labels on the survey was talking about the burden of blindness. And they were about to send this out. And I stood up and said, I have nothing against the survey, but to put a label like the burden of blindness really puts us steps and steps back. Let's think of some other ways to talk about that. If you're talking about the financial cost or the hours of caregiving provided, but they fortunately were able to listen to that and accept that, and that word burden was taken out.
Very nice. That's also a nice example of how that's current. That's not just ancient history. That's currently going on, and that's fits with the care of families as well, right? So, another aspect that we've had historically, and again, not completely gone, care of churches. When Christianity became part of our history, churches particularly became important in care related to disabilities. So we've seen that throughout history as well. Whether it was a church institution or churches supporting people in their homes, that was all relevant. Government also has played a role in this idea of burden on society throughout history. Government forms could be primarily institutions, including prisons. We can see if you look at the history of incarceration, even now there's a disproportionate number of individuals in prison who have disabilities. So this is, again, something through history that's not gone. It also includes asylums and schools. If I say the schools, I frequently might use that in quotes. Willowbrook State School on Staten Island is an example of an institution that was labeled as a school, but really was not. And that's another burden on society view. None of the above. I want to make sure we address the idea that when deinstitutionalization becomes a social priority, many times we see people with disabilities who are unhoused. And this is also another impact on society. All right, Elizabeth, any other comments? Shall we continue?
If we're talking about the ways that disability started to develop a little, social response to people with disabilities, it's interesting to talk about, again, that image of disability. Is it a burden or is it not? And when young men began coming back from wars as early as the American Revolution, and I'm doing the U.S. perspective. Of course, there are other perspectives as well. But then the Civil War, Spanish-American War, especially World War One. These boys, yes, they had some of the same disabilities as people who might have been born with disabilities, such as perhaps having to use a wheelchair or being blind, being deaf. And also mental health disabilities, such as what they used to call shell shock, what we now call PTSD. But at the same time, they were viewed as heroes, maybe fallen heroes. And so instead of let's hide them away or let's just consider them a burden, there was a great deal of ambiguity in society because these were our boys coming back. And as a result of that, veterans were a little bit more empowered to have a voice and to say, hey, we may have a disability, but we're young, we have our lives ahead of us, we want to work, we want to have some rights ensconced in law or ensconced in institutions, therefore the VA, therefore some of the early rehabilitation programs that began. So just want to acknowledge our veterans and any one of you who is out there who has done service, that they really were leaders in some of the early, both legal and social forms of rehabilitation that began to come through.
Yeah, it's important to consider that as we talk about, the perspective of a burden, that in this case, in that case with veterans, we had to break away from the idea of burden because we were grateful for their service and what they provided for us. It's good to have that counterpoint. So that's a lot of what we've seen in history has been that, and that leads into what we consider today as well. In fact, common themes also include, that drain on resources. If they're burdened, that means they're using resources. And at some points in history, that's a very important factor that resources are short, whether we're talking about actual food and water resources or if we're talking about financial resources. So a lot of times the bare minimum needs are met, which means education is not included. So it has been, throughout a lot of eras of history. The other side of that, nothing to give to society. So if they're drained on resources, they're also not contributing. Again, can argue that that's not gone. That's still a pervasive view that people with disabilities may not have anything to give to society. A lot of times that also includes the fact that our society, particularly as Elizabeth highlighted, we're talking US specifically here, when our value is related to our income, our ability to produce, then that drain, that burden becomes an emphasis. Whether we give somebody an opportunity to be productive and provide an income is another issue, but we also measure people by that. Also, we have throughout history the issue of fear and cursing, being cursed. So people on both sides of the disability have a connection to that. Society in general has frequently seen people with disabilities as being cursed and are afraid of them. On the other side, the person or the family with around the disability have fear based on that perception. Okay. A lot of times this also relates to mental health and seizures, but it relates to other types of disabilities as well. I see you nodding, Elizabeth.
Well, yes, just thinking about that and how many times when I've been somewhere, I really feel a fear response. Can I talk to her? She can't establish eye contact. How do I even get her attention? And when I was very young, there were some kids who thought blindness could even be contagious. Fortunately, that's not so much the thought now.
So it's not so much a curse per se, as you might think of curse, but again, going back to the burden and the difficulty. Okay, very good. So we've got these common themes that throughout history. And again, it's not just old history. This is recent and current aspects of some of this. Maybe not as widespread through society as it used to be, but still present. Some other themes, as I go through this list of themes on this slide, we see that these are not mutually exclusive through history where we've made progress. These are all present now and have all been present in the past, but we are over time changing our emphasis. From earlier history, more exclusion, staring and mocking related to the differences. Those we still have less emphasis than we used to. Sterilization or not being eligible for marriage, that has been a major issue throughout history. But again, still not gone because a lot of individuals with disabilities are considered that they should never get married. They should not have children. Paternalism, where we're protecting people. Again, we still have a substantial aspect of this. And moving more to the more positive side, allowances for disabilities, acceptance, and allowing autonomy so the person has the opportunity to make their own choices for their life. Again, still not mutually exclusive. All of those things exist, but we have more of the autonomy end at this point in time and less exclusion and mocking and staring, but they all still exist. Okay. All right, Elizabeth, I'm just giving you a pause in case anytime you want to jump in, feel free. If not, well, I'm going to keep moving.
Yeah, no, you're doing great.
All right, excellent. So the next point we need to consider, as we've talked about history so far, and we're talking about progressing history to the current time, we want to consider that in the modern era of disability history, that's when we started including laws. Older history did not have any kind of laws in place to protect people with disabilities. In the modern era, we started to add that, starting with things like the Social Security Act, some early Veterans Administration formation, moving through civil rights laws, structural barriers being addressed. So we have a variety of laws that are and have been enacted in the U.S. to allow rights for people with disabilities. Those laws are easy to look up. ADA is the one that we most commonly think of, but of course, IDEA, Architectural Barriers Act, various voting laws are also instrumental in advancing rights for people with disabilities. This is a foundation, though, and a lot of times we have the problem with society, people in general, considering those laws as the goal. Those are the ceiling. That's what we aim for. Those laws are actually enacted as a floor. Those are the bare minimum we should be accomplishing. We should be aiming well beyond that. So one of the issues we have related to this is we constantly have to be educating individuals. We have to keep moving the social aspect of acceptance and inclusion beyond the law, and increasing those opportunities. So we're not seeing that law as the ceiling. We've seen in the ADA, the major accomplishment with the ADA, where it allowed individuals with disabilities equal opportunities as a result of the law. But even then, from 1990 into 2009, we had to have amendments to the ADA because the interpretation had been adjusted. So it was not providing the opportunities that were intended. So we have to continue to advocate and move the expectations to go beyond that law. So this is where, as you know, taking this back to the idea of speech language pathology specifically, we want to make sure we remember we are in a position of advocacy to help move the expectations beyond the minimum of the law into more social inclusion that the laws are intended to be providing. So if we see somebody who's being an ableist or expressing ableist sorts of views, it's part of our responsibility to advocate and support the intended purposes of the law. This also brings me back to the point Elizabeth made earlier about the Veterans and Veterans Administration. This group of individuals have played a major role in helping to advance our inclusion and the rights of people with disabilities who may not have acquired those disabilities as a result of war. Okay.
If I could just break in too and say, when we're talking about the floor versus the ceiling, right now I'm staying in the state of Florida, and per the ADA, handicap parking places must be at a level of 2%. So if you have 100 parking places, you need to have 2 that are marked as handicap parking. But I've noticed down here that there are often many more, for the reason there are many elderly people or people who have a disability placard on their car, and they're being used. There's no law that you can't have more than 2% of parking to be disability. So that's a little floor to ceiling comparison there that I'll just throw in.
Very nice. Yeah, it's good to consider that that the law requiring a certain amount of accessible spaces, again, is a minimum. That if a facility, a building is designated for the purpose of disability, then that the number of spaces should be higher. Or as you indicated, a state like Florida, where the percentage is higher, the number of spaces should also be higher. a really nice illustration of the idea of ceiling and floor. All right, good. So the other current trends we want to consider as well is the idea of institutionalization. That is down, where there's not nearly as high a percentage of institutionalized individuals at this point in time. But since that cycles through, we need to be alert for any changes in our perspectives and our number of individuals who get put into institutions. We also need to consider the context of schools. If we're thinking institutionalization, even if it's a public school, that is an institution that a lot of children with disabilities are involved with. And we have to consider that impact also, not just residential institutions. Before IDEA, individuals with disabilities were not allowed to attend their local school. They had to be taken to either a different school or not taken to a school at all. Elizabeth, you've got a story about that.
Yeah, and I do want to just amend. It was that before IDEA, public schools were not required to take students with disabilities. They could if they wanted to, but they could also just as easily say, no, we don't want this student. And that was exactly the situation that I ran into. The first 3 years of my education, 2 years, I went to the Ohio State School for the Blind. In the next 3 years, I went to what was then called a sight-saving class. So it was students who were blind or visually impaired in another city. So it was about a 45-minute commute either way every day to get there and to come back. And for both that reason and just the reason that I wanted to be with my local peers, my parents came to the town where I was and said, we want our daughter to be in your schools. And being pre-IDEA, they said no. My parents had to hire a lawyer. Now, granted, full disclosure, this was a lawyer who was a gentleman from our church and a gentleman who said, give me $1 so we can call this a legal contract. So this man was really fighting for this because he believed in it. Went to the Board of Education, and they very reluctantly said, we will consider this. And in the middle of the summer, they said, we will have this 8-year-old girl escorted by a policeman to walk from her house to the school to see whether she is a community hazard. So I don't know how they were defining a blind girl with a white cane as a community hazard, but I vividly remember a hot day in the summer walking the 4 blocks, crossing about 4 streets with a policeman and talking with him. And the fact that he said at the end of it, he said, honey, you're not a danger to anybody. You're going to the school. I mean, I had him in my pocket in the sense that he was glad to make the recommendation that I was not dangerous. And after that, I did begin going to my own public schools. Now, I will just add as a quick addendum, I did fine academically, but socially, because these students had never dealt with another student with a visible disability, and most of the teachers hadn't either. It was very much an uphill climb socially, a very painful climb, but I made it.
And that's so good that you did. Thank you for the clarification too. I did not mean to imply that before IDA schools couldn't. They just weren't required to. Absolutely. Yes, I have another story, another individual I know with cerebral palsy whose parents' house backed up to an elementary school that he was not allowed to go to. He was bused for a long distance each direction so he could go to a school that was considered appropriate for him. So even though he was right next to a school, he couldn't attend that school pre-IDEA. So this, again, this is recent history. It may not be in everybody's lifetime now, but some of us were around during those days. So inclusion in schools has become much better as a result of the laws we've enacted. Special education is still a concern because it would talk about mainstreaming versus inclusion. Many schools still have mainstreaming as opposed to inclusive education. We're still in the process of evolving that educational process so children are more included with each other and given the equitable education, equitable opportunities in schools. We also have the idea of pull-out therapy. Again, taking this back to speech language pathology specifically. We still have some pull-out therapy. We have therapy within the classroom. Working on making sure that whatever our choices are the best for that child. Generalization being a major issue. How is the best way for us to provide the services that we are in the schools for? We'll continue to move that direction as we talk a little bit further. The other part I wanted to consider with current trends is consideration of accuracy of testing. We need to be paying close attention to whether we are considering something as a disorder or versus a difference. And this is where we start to think about our terminology, our use of words when we're talking about individuals that we're working with. At the moment, we've been referring to children. This applies to adults just as well. Whether we're considering what a person's communication skills are like, are we considering them disordered, or is it just something different and they can still communicate effectively? We always want to make sure our testing is accurate. We want to consider that any kind of a diagnosis we have is accurate, but we have to be careful that that's actually what we're accomplishing. We know that's what we want, and we are doing I think most of us do a really good job with that, but we want to make sure we're always cognizant of differences that may affect that testing. Am I testing somebody who comes from a different cultural background? And how does that culture intersect with the test I'm using? Is that person's response appear less accurate because of that cultural influence? Am I interpreting it differently because of that culture? If I'm looking at people with different socioeconomic status, again, is the testing material that I'm using actually appropriate for that individual? Am I misinterpreting some of their responses based on an expectation from the standardization of the test? Yes.
And if I could just add that there are some cases where we miss it because of intersectionality. I have a very close friend who went to blind camp with me when I was a kid. And, everyone responded to the fact that she was blind. But she has said as an adult, everyone, because I was bright and I was blind, completely missed the fact that I was also very, very ADHD. They were working with the blindness. To a certain degree, they were working with the fact that I was smart. But my other issues that I had that really affected my social interactions and my education, because those other two things were so prominent in the minds of people who were doing the testing and doing some of the work with me, they just never thought about it. So that's a big one where many people have more than one, type of a disability or something that they might need a little bit of help with.
Absolutely. That's another influence besides culture and socioeconomic status. Is what else is involved in that individual? It may be they are very intelligent and therefore in a gifted context. People assume gifted, and therefore we miss some aspects that we might want to address to help that individual reach their potential. Is it two different types of disabilities, ADHD, blindness, as Elizabeth's example? Are we addressing all of those concerns? Is our testing being accurate for that? Again, we go to school, we learn all of our skills, we learn about the testing, but we need to remember, is that testing covering what I need it to be covering? Is it my default? If I find that I've done the testing and I've started working with an individual, and then I find out more, say ADHD, in addition to the communication issues that impairments I'm looking at, can I adjust? Am I doing the right thing? Do I need to adjust what I'm doing? A lot of what we're saying today is assumed. Most of us as speech language pathologists do these things. It's just important to consider it explicitly. Am I mindfully considering what I'm doing? Is this absolutely the right thing? Yes, it is. Wonderful. I'm going to continue. Do I need to reconsider something I'm doing? This is what we want to keep in mind today. So this is current trends and relating this back to what we actually do. Right now, with that in mind, we are getting more and more conscious of intersectionality, more and more conscious of culture and other kinds of differences. One of the things that we need to consider is that students with speech language disorders are the largest group of students covered by the IDEA. And that's something we may not think about on a regular basis, that what we are doing impacts a lot of lives. I think we know that, but are we thinking about that every day? That that we're talking about communication impairments that are disabling to children. Again, this is that child focus. Extrapolate this to adults. That we're talking about a large group of individuals that we're having an impact on. We also need to remember that the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement that we're dealing with right now in our society in general applies to disability. It applies to what we're doing. That DEI is very important in the context of our communication impairments and what we're doing with individuals. So we want to consider that, bringing back the culture, the ethnicity, the SES, those kinds of things are all part of what we need to consider with this. Elizabeth, would you like to take a moment to talk about person first and identity first? Because if we're talking about language and culture and these kinds of opportunities, I think this is a good time to mention that.
If you had the opportunity, and if you didn't, it's fine, to read my bio in the first slides. I have a master's degree in journalism from OSU. I've done a lot of articles and newsletters and interviews. I also am a creative writer, and I write some literature that has characters with disabilities and some that doesn't. But it's interesting to think about the terms in which we ensconce anyone of any identity. But recently, there's certainly been a movement against when we say, for example, the lame, the blind, the deaf. We usually don't say that anymore. I find it interesting. We still use it in a few places without thinking much of it as the Amish, the Midwesterners, the graduates. But many people are strongly in favor of saying people who are visually impaired, people who are on the spectrum, etc. My advice when we're talking is to use common sense and to think about how it sounds when we're speaking in context. But something that I have often also used in my own both written and spoken communication is when we're talking about a group, it's a community. So often instead of saying blind people, I have spoken or written the non-visual community, or perhaps I'll say people who use sign language instead of deaf, or those who need wheelchairs. But also, thinking about the word community or groups of people who have can be other ways to work around, still kind of being functional. Again, the non-visual community means people who aren't, reading with their eyes, for example, or, so just thinking about that and how it sounds and trying to not put this really square box of the around a group, or, saying, again, blind people or deaf people, because it sounds so categoric and so boxed in with some of the stereotypes that we've had over the centuries.
Well, and to follow up on that as well, considering that some people do want that identity first, people do want to be considered a blind person or an autistic person or a deaf person because it's so integral to who they are. So we need to consider whether we don't want to group somebody as an entire lump, but how do they want to be identified themselves as that individual? Once we've gotten past that lump, how do you want to be addressed? Elizabeth, you personally, how do you prefer?
Well, I'm going to say one of my favorite stories that I heard on National Public Radio. There was a gentleman who had Down syndrome, and they were talking about changing the word retarded to with developmental disabilities. And one of the reporters, who probably has a Harvard education and, wonderful reporter, but was interviewing this gentleman. And he just kept saying, well, no, I don't like the R word. I don't really like the word developmental disabilities. It's a hard word to say. And the reporter finally, and I could hear a little bit of exasperation in his voice. And he said, well, what should I call you? And the man who he was being interviewed said, just call me Bill. Just call me Bill. And honestly, I would say, call me Elizabeth, call me a writer, call me an OSU graduate. And yes, of course, I have a visual impairment or low vision, or if you will, blind or legally blind. But because that's not the primary part of my identity, um, it's not something that has to come absolutely to the front.
Absolutely. And so it's an individual preference. You have a very clear individual preference. That's wonderful. But knowing what the person wants to be called is important. Bottom line comes down to asking, right? Ask what, like the reporter did, he got his answer. Absolutely.
One of the greatest NPR moments that I recall.
And the last item I have here relates to labels too. I mean, the label is an important concept. Labels are difficult. Labels can be limiting. But on the other hand, labels can also be freeing, because once you have a label, you know what to identify. You can get access to what you need if you have a label. So labels are also a tricky topic for people, but an important one for us to consider. Not a straightforward answer for everybody, but something we need to know, need to think about regularly. Okay. So this is the way we're going here, and considering that speech pathologists work with words, we want to consider these things, and we can be leaders in terms of how words get used and how we're helping people understand those words. Okay. So at this point, then, this is kind of where we are. I want to set some groundwork related to medical model and social model. So there are different ways of interpreting those models. What do we mean by those? So I want to set down what we're going to talk about here today in those contexts. These are really critical to what we do. The first model I want to talk about today is the medical model. And in the medical model, it's all about the individual. It's the fault of the individual for not being the same as everybody else. Their limitations are based on their own issues. It's their individual, and as a result of that disability being within that individual, we need to cure them. So we have to make the person more normal. And on the slide, I have those in quotes for a very strong reason. Very closely related to the medical model is the rehabilitative model in the structure that I use as my default. And that kind of adaptation to that is that the deficiencies must be reduced by helping professionals through training, counseling, and therapy. So the cure is not a medicine. It's not surgery. The cure is through treatment with an expert. And that's what we're based on. All of our health-related professions are based on this sort of a model. We're going to fix people with our skills. We use ICD-10 for our description, for our billing, for all aspects. The ICD is the basis for the classification. Our labels are based on that. So, and the ICD is basically just a description of the impairment, but we use that as the basis for what we do. So our default is medically based, medical model, rehabilitative model base. So we have to deal with that. That's what we learn in school. That's what all of our principles are on. We're trying to fix the differences and the disorders. All right. So the next side, the other side of that is social model. The social model is that the disability is a consequence of environmental, social, and attitudinal barriers. So it's not the individual's impairments that are disabling, it's the world around them. It's the attitudes, it's the structures, things like those sorts of aspects. That an impairment doesn't mean disability, but the impairment in interaction with the environment around is what results in the disability. It's the societal influences that restrict the ability to participate in the community. Very closely related to this is the disability and rights-based model, where basically disability is a normal part of life. Yes, we all deal with disability in some aspect. It's how we define disability, how our environment defines disability, that makes it that. So I could highlight weaknesses that I have personally that in a different environment would disable me. Elizabeth, your vision disables you in a visually based world, but it would not if the world was not visually based around you.
Or as in the case when I was in college as an undergrad and there was a hurricane and all the lights went out. I was going to the girls' dorm rooms and finding stuff for them. Yeah, I often tell my disability, my friends who have disabilities, like, let's face the fact that we're simply living in a world that was not built with our assumptions in mind, is how I often say it. And so we have to navigate that creatively.
I love that description. That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it's all basically that, it's just set up for me, not for you. And when that situation's reversed, I'm the one who's disabled.
Or as in the case when I'm a language interpreter, it's like
Mhm.
I'm in a room with deaf people, but I'm able to say the two languages that are being spoken one to the other. So
Mhm.
again, I can be the navigator in that situation.
Absolutely. See, it's not your strengths and weaknesses, or strengths and impairments. It's the situation you're in that's the impact. That's the bottom line of disability rights and social model. We all have something that's it could be disabling in a certain circumstance. And so we just have to consider that. I've been surrounded by disability throughout my entire life, and it's just part of what happens. It's something we all deal with. And in contrast, the ICD for the medical model, the ICF is relevant for classification because that deals with disability. The ICF considers the impairment, but also the environmental circumstances around the individual. The parts, these environmental circumstances are what perpetuate disability. These are the aspects that make it go on, and especially if we're thinking about attitudinal differences, that perpetuates disability. That's something that we as an entire population can adjust. We can make that difference. So that's setting the groundwork for the models that we're talking about today, how the focus is in terms of what we do and how we talk about what we're doing. That makes a difference for us. Now, I want to pick out some words that are very specific to medical model and social model and kind of compare and contrast them. And Elizabeth, I'm going to encourage you to chime in whenever you want to on this, because language is, as much as I love language is absolutely a love of yours as well. So the first contrast I've got here between medical model and social model is helplessness versus autonomy. And in terms of this, how are we managing the strategies we're using with individuals? In speech pathology, what are we doing with an individual? Are we encouraging the helplessness that we're going to fix the problem? Or are we encouraging the autonomy and you can take control and you can manage this aspect of your life?
And I would just add that empowerment, finding the core motivation that we're going to talk about in a minute, is really, really an essential thing to empower someone as opposed to fixing them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Autonomy is so critical to us, isn't it? The next contrast I've got here is cure versus care. Are we trying to fix our clients, or are we trying to support them in what they want to accomplish? Mm-hmm. The third item I've got here, comparing medical model of safety and social model of risk. Who are we protecting and how are we protecting? Am I protecting somebody from, taking a chance and failing? Am I really respecting and empowering that person if I'm keeping them safe? We see this a lot, especially with individuals with developmental disabilities and their parents protecting them. That's definitely falls into the camp of medical model. I don't want you to get hurt. I'm going to protect you because you need some protection. Versus the individuals where I know parents of individuals with developmental disabilities who let them go out and make their own choices and let them do something wrong because that's the best way we learn.
Or as in my case, I was very fortunate to have parents who were allowing me to take risks after I finished high school. They let me, as a young girl with visual impairments, go be an exchange student in another country. And only now, as I get older and have my own daughter, do I think, wow, they were really brave and trusting and believed in me and also believed in the power of risk as well to allow something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to allow you to not only be on your own, but in another country. So absolutely. And I know a family locally who has a daughter with a developmental disability, and they encourage her. You know, she wanted to get tattoos, and they've allowed her to get tattoos because that's what she wants, and she's very happy with it. It was a risk they were willing to take to let her do what she wanted, and it's been a very good thing for the entire family. So that opportunity to move from medical model and, oh, we can't do that, that's not a good idea, to risk, it's like, if that's what you want, it's, I'm not going to let you, get really hurt, of course, but no parent would, but let you make your own choices and do it for yourself. And it's a wonderful opportunity. Elizabeth, you have so many stories from that experience that was so wonderful for you.
Yes, yes,
Uh-huh.
it was. And I would never be the person I am today or be able to encourage other young people with disabilities to say, I know what you're going through because I've gone through that. But there's so much more in life than what maybe your parents or your teachers have imagined. And what, calculate what it takes. Think about, the consequences. But if you want to do it, try it. Maybe you need to do some baby steps, some rehearsals. We're going to talk about that later. Some things to prepare yourself, but be be ready. Try to embrace what you really want to embrace. Don't be afraid.
I love what you just said, that, basically that the parents would not be able to imagine that on their own. So by limiting an individual, we take things off the table that are absolutely options, but we can't think of them, therefore they're gone. And it's much better to be a support to help learn, set expectations, and to help plan, than to say you can't do that. So much better. And that, the bottom item I have on this slide is marginalized versus empowerment. Medical model, we're marginalizing people. No, you can't do that. It's not safe. No, you can't do that because we need to fix the problem. No, you need somebody there with you. That's marginalizing people. Empowering someone by giving them the social constructs allows them to fully participate. Go back to the idea of autonomy, by empowering somebody, by changing that approach from medical to social. All things that we can easily do. And in relating this, making sure we keep in mind speech pathology specifically. We're in a perfect situation, a perfect role to do that, to encourage that empowerment. So
maybe I should just jump in here with my little motivation story.
Oh, sure, you can do that now.
This is a story that I love. When I've met any speech pathologist, I love to tell the story and say just how important your work is. So when I was a child, I spoke English normally. And then there was a point where I lost a few of my front teeth, just normally, and corrected for the sibilant sounds, for the Z, for the S, and never quite went back to uh, the original way I had done it when my teeth grew back in. So from around the time I was 8 or 9 years old to mid-teens, I had a pronounced lisp. And I didn't really care. For whatever reason, it was mom always bugging me about it. It was speech pathologist after speech pathologist. And yes, I would do their exercises, but I just didn't matter to me for whatever reason. And one day my mother and I were in a department store. I had started high school and I was studying French, and French was my very favorite subject. And I just loved to try to use it because for me, another language was like a different way of, again, my love of words, a different way to use words and a different way to say something, and something that was like a code that someone could understand that other people couldn't. And there was a French clerk at that store. And I was just thrilled. It was the first French person I'd ever spoken to. So I'm sure my French was broken and imperfect, but she was thrilled that this teen girl would try in the USA to use proper French with her. And at the end, she said to my mother, I believe, your daughter speaks so well. And then she turned to me, she said, it's just a shame that you have that lisp. If you didn't have it, your French would be almost perfect. And bingo, that was my motivation. And I went to the speech therapist the next week. I said, I'm going to learn how to say S and Z. And I worked on it. And within a week or two, I had it right. It was that key motivation that you find with someone to help them. And in my case, it was mastering the foreign code. And no, it's not logical, it's not rational. You could say to a teenager, well, yeah, but when you speak your own language, it's going to help you with that. But it doesn't always matter what you think. It's really finding what is important to them. And since I wanted to speak perfect French, and it took that, did it immediately.
Very nice. And that, we can come back to that later as well, talking about that motivation. That's what mattered. That was important to you, not what anybody else cared about. And then we need to consider that as well. Absolutely. So if we're talking about disability studies, I want to, part of the name of this presentation is about disability studies and disability culture. So what does this bring to us? The whole idea of disability studies is promoting those values we care about with the social model. Respect, respecting the individual, respecting their autonomy, giving the person autonomy, communication amongst all the individuals who may be related to what we're doing, or promoting the value of individuality. I can't impose on you my priorities, my what's important to me. Advocacy is really important, and this is an area that I want to make sure we emphasize, as speech pathologists as well, that we can be advocates. We're supposed to be advocates. We need to be advocates. And how are we advocating? How can we do that? How can we improve the approach to disability, even if we're talking strictly communication impairments, but also a lot of the intersection of other disabilities as well. Disability studies are very interdisciplinary, so we should be involving all of our colleagues with this. Disability studies includes social work, all the therapies, medical, educators, lawyers, politicians, anybody can be connected with disability studies. And it focuses on those social barriers. This really identifies with the social model, taking away the focus on the individual as the cause of a problem and more society as the cause of a problem. Okay. The impairment is with the person, the disability is with all of us. So, where are we now? I mean, we've been talking about history. We're talking about where we've been recently, where our current biases, and what we need to think about in terms of language and what our mental focus is. So where we are identifying our approach in general, which brings us to the title of ableism. Ableism is that, where we're working from. We all have some aspect of it, and how much is it influencing what we do? So where are we now with all this history of segregation and all these challenges and placed on individuals with disabilities, considering the burdens and all these things? We still have some of that we've identified, but we don't have to that same level now. But where are we? We're not in a utopia. So where are we with this? We have to consider that ableism still. So this is our opportunity to continue to make it better, to do a better job. And this is where we want to branch off now, keep us moving forward. Okay. So one of the things we want to think about, I think, is our attitudes. And we're working with communication impairments. I say on the slide, communication disorders, because that's our default. That's what we've always referred to them as. But are they disorders? And if they're disorders, are they disabilities? So disorders is our usual medical term for something that's outside the range of what we consider normal. And I would challenge us to use the word typical instead of normal. So is it a disability or is it not? How many of us do consider that communication impairment we're interacting with a person about as a disability? Okay. Is it truly, or is it just a difference, or is it just something that we need to help them manipulate and work their life around? How do we view that? So do we see it as in this context, or are we seeing it as something isolated? Remember that IDEA covers individuals with speech and language disabilities or speech and language disorders. Again, I will try to adjust that to impairment as opposed to disorder in terms of separating terms. Now, Elizabeth, I'm going to challenge you to take us to the next step here relating to the words handicapped, disabled, and differently abled. How would you encourage us to address that?
So the origin of the word handicap goes back to the 18th or 19th century, when a lot of beggars on the street held out their caps in their hand and asked for money. And so it kind of became referred to as handicap or the handicapped. Now, when I was younger, it didn't really bother me. That was the word I grew up with. I was handicapped, and we'll get back to that later on too. But now, when I'm more aware of the origin and the history of that, and the pretty negative developed connotations of that word, I personally have avoided using it. We still talk about handicapped parking. I like to use the word disability parking, or mobility parking, accessible parking. There are lots of ways you can use other words. So just again, keep in mind the word and its origin. Disability or disabled, it's a word we often use. We use it for vehicles. When in the traffic reports, you hear the disabled vehicle. You use it for people as well. I'm always aware of the word dis, and we say respectful, disrespectful, etc. It's not a word that I think it's a word that has had a neutral connotation. I'm not sure that it even still has the neutral connotation. And again, sometimes it depends the way that it's said or the context. But as we use it, we want to be careful in who our audience is, whether it's our readers or our family, if we're speaking with a family or a person. Differently abled, it's a little tortured. And it's also something that can sound a little bit, for lack of another word, a little bit Mr. Rogers, I'm okay, you're okay. It is true that people who have a sensory or another functional difference from people who are typical, it's true that they have different abilities. For example, I use more auditory and tactile clues than the typical person or the person with typical vision. That doesn't mean that I have a superpower, but it means I'm tuned in, as are people with other different abilities. Don't torture the language. I think, if you hear how a person refers to him or herself, if it seems to be in a healthy context of self-respect, it may be that if a parent or a friend refers to someone as handicapped, you may want to ask them, is that how you view the person, as someone who really is unable to do something? So it's really just considering the language and the context in which it's spoken. And the cliche is, it's not what you said, it's the way you said it. I have a father who was born in the 1930s who used handicapped and who used racial terms that are no longer accepted today. And yet he was one of the greatest advocates for both race and ability of anyone I knew in my life. It's not always your words, it's your context and it's how you live it out. But think about the words too.
I always like to emphasize respect is the bottom line with that. Yeah. So whatever word you're using, as long as it's not notably offensive, it's about the way you say it. It's the respect you're giving. So this kind of, considering those words also affects how we view the person sitting across from this table from us in a therapy setting, in any kind of a setting. We know that words alter our thoughts, thoughts alter our words. So that interaction between the two, Are we using the words that are reflecting or influencing the way we think? We need to consider that. If I'm using the word handicapped, does that reflect or does that influence how I'm seeing that person? Is it pushing me into a more of a medical model where I need to fix them versus saying disabled, differently able, whichever is appropriate for that context? Is that leading me to more the social model, allowing autonomy and respect and those aspects we care about with disability culture in general? So we want to consider those words. And thank you, Elizabeth, for helping. I mean, differently abled, I know people who prefer differently abled, but you're right, it's a little bit of kind of torturing the language, trying to make things fit so that they don't sound offensive to somebody. So there might be settings where that is appropriate, but there may be situations where you wouldn't want to do that. Absolutely. And as I further elaborate on what you just said. All right. So the application of the models. Now we're staying with the idea of words and going back to the medical versus social model. And Elizabeth, I'm going to put you on as a hotspot for this as well. Words related to medical model and social model, contrasting therapy and activity.
Yeah, when you're talking about therapy, it feels like you're trying to fix someone. And that they need this so that they're able to function in a more typical way. Activity is such a nice active word, and it's a word that what you're doing will be exactly the same thing perhaps, but just getting someone active and getting them involved, included, as opposed to using the let's fix them kind of a word of therapy. I have nothing against the word therapy in overall context, but say if you're doing equestrian, or say you're doing art, or say you're doing sports, or even speech, it's something that can be an activity and something that feels more inclusive to me.
Yeah. So I would see that, in certainly maybe out of the context of the individual I'm working with, therapy might be an appropriate term to relate to other colleagues, but definitely with the individual that I'm dealing with, I might want to avoid that word because of the connotation of fixing and help. Right?
Absolutely. That's part
of
I'm watching you talk.
Walking the talk. Absolutely. So I can see times that when the difference is important, that I might need to say therapy because other people will understand what I mean then. But that's not empowering for the individual. Okay. And activity is just an example. There are many other words we could use in that place, right? Absolutely. The next comparison I've got here, special needs versus support. I've heard reference to, my child doesn't have special needs. My child needs the same thing your child needs. They just need a different way of getting there. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. And, again, the word support is a much more inclusive word. And in fact, inclusive support could even be, because most, especially young people, they want to be part of the bigger group. They want to feel like they fit in. So that kind of idea of just how to help someone fit in is such a big deal with developmental levels and how someone is going to feel about him or herself when they're working as a young person to find who they are.
Yeah, I think to me the word special indicates you're different from everybody else. So that is going to be isolating on that social basis, absolutely, with those peers. Okay, and I'm even taking it to that level of putting in the context of bullying makes a difference. Words like that can make a difference in that context as well. The next contrast, patient and client or student. This one should be self-evident, right?
It's so, and I have worked in vocational rehabilitation. So obviously I've worked and I've called people clients, which is acceptable, as an adult. But when you're talking about student or someone that you're working with, it has the feeling of being collegial, being in the process together. And yeah, it's a term that is a more together term.
Okay, very nice. And the last contrast I have on here is nonverbal versus non-speaking. Do you have any comments on that?
I think that when we're talking about nonverbal, it gives the impression that you're unable to verbalize. And non-speaking may be that you're not doing that right now, but it may mean that there are possibilities to develop this ability. And it's it's I think a less judgmental term, perhaps, in particular to me being part of the non-visual community. When I hear the word nonverbal, especially nonverbal communication, I very often feel very excluded from that, because if someone is winking at someone else and someone else is waving, I don't know that. But that's, again, that's particular to non-visual. Of course, if you're talking about someone from the non-hearing community, nonverbal may be very, very important and in a positive context to them. So again, some of these are relative terms, and you have to think, who is your audience? Who are the people that you're addressing when you're using these terms?
And not if nonverbal, am I assuming they're not capable of the code of language versus non-speaking, where they're perfectly capable of language, they just don't use it in a spoken context. So again, I think a lot of speech language pathologists assume nonverbal means they still can have language skills, but that's not always what's conveyed in the word. And being conscious of possible interpretations makes a difference. And the assumptions, the underlying implicit biases that go with that as well. It's like assuming that nonverbal means they can't use language and they just can't speak the language. Okay, so again, choice of words makes a difference. Which is more expert dependent? Which one is more medical versus which one is more empowering and equalizing, inclusive? How do we choose those words? Can we do better? So the next idea, we've already touched on risk as a social right, a social focus. And we have two different ways we can think about risk when we're talking about speech pathology. And the first one I want to think about is risk for the client. So making the strategy optional for the client. This is something that we emphasize, that you have a right, you can't force someone to do a therapy, can't force a strategy. They have the choice to do that. We need to make sure we are actually living that. We're walking that talk. So we want to make sure we're doing that. Is the need, is what I want the person to do actually something they truly need? Or is it just something that's going to help them appear more typical? So how important is that? So is it going to be a real risk for the individual if they don't do it? So what are the limits to letting that person decide what they want to do? Okay. If we're looking at children, does the child have the agency to make that choice for themselves? So a child is not mature. Can they choose not to do this? We have to think about that. What if it's an older person who has cognitive deficits, who have impairments? Can they make the choice for themselves? Consider that. How does that factor into what I'm trying to get the person to do? If the person really does need this skill, how can I motivate them? I'm going to go back to Elizabeth's story about her speech and the motivation. If it's really something they absolutely need to do, how do I motivate the person? Clearly, I wouldn't have motivated Elizabeth to overcome her lisp.
And let me just throw in another little story here too. A big issue in both the community of people on the spectrum and people with visual impairments is eye contact. Now, there are two totally different causes for that. But, my parents were always saying, look at me, give eye contact. Sometimes they would literally take my face and bring it up, because they did realize that socially in the sighted world, this was a really important thing. And part of me really said, well, I can't really give eye contact. I don't even know what it means to meet someone's eyes. And I finally realized that my eye contact was always going to be fake, but I could still fake it and people would think it was real. And so it didn't matter as much. So I began to be more accepting once I accepted the fact that no, I won't really be giving it to them, but they will think that. And that will help me socially to have that skill. Um, maybe if you're working with someone with on the spectrum or, again, who has the visual impairment to say, you know, you don't really have to do it, but people have to think you're doing it. And it's an innocent deception in a way.
I think that's an excellent example. Why are we emphasizing eye contact, especially with individuals on the spectrum? It's like, is it truly something they need, or is it something we want just to make them appear more typical? What's our motivation? If eye contact is important for that individual and they recognize it as important as well, at least at some level, then absolutely work on it. But if it's not critical to them, do we need to work on it? We need to assess this.
Or maybe even wear sunglasses.
Absolutely. Are there?
There are lots of ways to address it.
Yes, and absolutely. We need to consider what is the focus, what's the priority, how are we going to get there? Am I doing it just because the school expects it? Am I doing it just because somebody, as employer, expects it? Or is it because it's important to that individual? A lot of times we set our goals based on social expectations, right? And we want to be careful about that. There may be a good justification for that, but if there isn't, we need to assess whether that's something we work on or not. So we need to consider those kinds of things. Does it actually meet their needs? Or is it we're doing just to perpetuate our biases? Are we doing it in perpetuating ableism, that they should look typical in order to fit in, to be successful? The other thing is, if we let them make their choices and we choose not to focus on eye contact or something like that, what will the consequences be? Will there be social consequences? Will there be employment consequences, etc.? And if the person is not motivated to work on those, are they able to live with whatever consequences there might be? Right. Because even as we adjust our focus, that doesn't mean the world around us is adjusting their focus along. So we have to address, what will be the outcome if we fully embrace that individual's priorities? Will the outcome of that be acceptable to the individual? So one of the challenges that we have is not only adjusting our perspective and modifying our approach, but also balancing that with the world around us. So, all right. So that's risk for the client. How can we make that work? How can we choose what's really important and let them have autonomy, let them have control of what we're working on? Because it's their rights, it's their empowerment to be able to do that. The other side of that is risk for the clinician. What risk am I taking on if I take the approach that my client, my student can make the choices of what we're working on? What do I put myself at risk for? And some of the risks we might encounter if we take this approach is our employer going to criticize us for not working on what they think we should be working on? So if I'm not following those expectations set up by society, those expectations that go along with the medical model, am I going to be criticized for not doing my job properly? That's something we need to be aware of and consider balance and how we will address that. Since one of the realities of our world is payment for what we do, are we in a situation where if I'm not addressing those typical goals, will a payer, will Medicare, will some kind of insurance not pay for my services because they don't see what I'm doing as valid? That's a risk we need to deal with as well. Social issues. Will other people, will the family or others around the individual accept those differences? The peers in the classroom, peers at work, will they accept a difference based on that individual's needs, or will they expect typical behavior? So as a clinician, am I meeting those expectations as well when those also balance with the individual's particular preferences? And the last one I have here is the colleague expectations. If I'm doing my job focusing on this social model, and the people I'm working with, the rest of my team, is focusing on the medical model, am I not meeting their expectations as well? This is not necessarily a priority that I should make at the cost of my client, but it's something I'm going to have to factor. It's a risk that I might take with my team. All right, Elizabeth, any comments, or should we move on?
I think we can go ahead.
Absolutely. Excellent. This is more, you're not a speech pathologist, so this makes a difference, right?
But I sure do appreciate you all.
Well, and then, since I introduced the idea of ableism, intentional ableism is kind of, are we setting those goals based on typical expectation? Am I intentionally setting goals on the idea that you should sound like a typical communicator? You should be able to accomplish a variety of daily activities based on cognitive skills so that you look typical. If I'm setting my goals strictly on that basis, am I being an ableist intentionally? Am I disregarding your priorities and your innate needs in order to make you look typical? That may not be the case in a particular example. We're talking about, overall ideas here. So you may have an individual where it's not ableist to have them look as typical as possible. Especially if it's their priority, they want to blend in. If they don't want to look different, that may not be ableist. But I'm not being ableist if I'm trying to expect all of my clients to look typical. So that's a consideration we need to keep in mind. Part of why we want to consider the terms, the words we're using. Are we perpetuating this? And is it by our choices? Are we doing this because this is what we prioritize? Back to the idea of language again. We've talked about patient versus client or student. I have this on this slide as well because this is so important. Other ways we talk about what we do is correcting a problem. We're correcting something. And can we talk about it more in terms of moving towards effective communication? Is our goal effectiveness, or is it, fixing something? So personally, I know of a lot of speech pathologists who focus on, getting correct language, getting correct structures, correct vocabulary. And how important is that? Are we correcting that, or do we just want you to be more effective? So how we talk about that can affect what we think about. We've already talked about patient and client or student. Therapy versus working together or shared activity or talking with each other. We've addressed that one as well. But now in this context, are we perpetuating our ableism, or are we being more socially and personally aware and focusing on the individual? Special needs versus disability, nonverbal versus non-speaking. Again, we've already talked about these, but keeping this in context, this is a big part of what we want to emphasize today is how are we choosing our words? I see plenty of nodding, Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, I'm just, as a linguist, as a journalist, as an advocate, I'm just agreeing how important this is and considering that context that you're putting the words in.
Mm-hmm. And how this colors the way we think. It really affects the way we think.
It does, really.
All right. Now, that's kind of goes into intentional ableism, perpetuating those perspectives, that medical model. But we also do it accidentally. We all do it accidentally. Every single one of us is ableist at times without wanting to be. So we have to deal with that as well, because I'm always going to make that mistake. I catch myself doing this on a relatively regular basis where I say something, it's like, oops, that's not what I meant. I did not intend for that to come out that way. So how do I navigate? I have students in my courses who can be afraid of saying the wrong thing. What if I say something wrong? And they might be intimidated by interacting with somebody because they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing. What happens if I do it wrong? How can I be respectful? How should I approach the individual? How should I approach their family respectively? How to avoid those mistakes? Yeah. What do you think, Elizabeth? What can you help us with? I have here some examples you've given me in the past about do you see what I mean, or did you hear?
Yes. So I'm fortunate that I've been able to study some different languages in my life. And I can really tell you every language I've studied, both European and non-European, they'll use the word see with the implication of understanding something, and the word hear with also understanding something, also walk or go. So some people are afraid to use the word, for example, see, do you see what I mean, in front of a blind person, or did you hear in front of a person who's deaf? Um, I can really almost categorically say that you are not going to offend someone by using words that have to do with sensory functions or abilities. Uh, it's different if you say, oh, yeah, see where that yellow car is going? That's a literal sense. Or, did you hear I just heard the greatest bird, did you hear it? Um, and again, you might be asking for acuity, and that's not offensive. But when you're using it in the sense of taking in information or mobility, going somewhere, walking somewhere, it's something that linguistically is simply part of our language. And I have never heard, in fact, the first time I was ever asked about whether the word see was offensive, I think I was a teenager or maybe in my early 20s. I didn't even understand the question. And it took me a minute, and then I think I laughed. So, and I would say 99.9% of the disability community would agree with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of phrases we use. We don't even concern ourselves with the origin at this point. We just use them. Right. And we do risk, if you think about the origin, maybe it is offensive on one dimension or another, but we don't use them that way as a rule. And it's a learning opportunity. Absolutely. Actually, so I can learn, oops, I don't want to do that again. Or, use you at our advantage. You can teach us some of these things. That it's not offensive to do that. Again, and you're speaking for yourself. You're not speaking for everybody, but it's a good it's a good example. Absolutely. So yeah, we make mistakes, but I go back to the idea of if I'm addressing you, if I'm interacting with you respectfully, most people will, say, well, oops, please don't do that again. Or I understand what you meant, but I prefer it this way. So if you can make a mistake, as long as you're approaching the person in a good manner, it's easy to recover from that and learn for the next time.
Absolutely.
Also part about accidental ableism, I want to go back to the idea of misdiagnosis. We talked about that before, so we don't need to spend much time talking about it now. But if I make a mistake, if I get a diagnosis wrong, what impact is that going to have? Does that affect how I'm interacting with the person in a wrong way? Am I trying to encourage them to be more typical when it's not appropriate? It's not the best way for them to approach their life. A lot of times we think about misdiagnosis more in terms of a medical context, a medical diagnosis, but it's an issue for speech pathology as well. Is it apraxia? Is it, aphasia? Some of those kinds of differences that we might make a mistake somewhere along the way. Some developmental language issues. Have I got it right or have I got it wrong? Is there ADHD as part of this? Is there dyslexia that I am or am not catching? So if it's just a difference, what if I don't really need to address it? It's okay. It's not going to be a difficulty for the individual. And I have the keywords cultural humility on this slide, because a big part of that is being, willing to admit that I make a mistake. Maybe it's because it's a cultural difference. It's not really an impairment because of the cultural interaction. So being aware that I don't know these things, other people know more than I do, makes a difference. Yes.
And just a quick example with that, my favorite optometrist, the first time I met her, I was having an eye infection and some real issues. And her first words to me were, "You've lived with your eyes for about 40 years. So you know an awful lot more about your eyes than I do. What's going on right now?" And that was just one of the most endearing things she could have said made me feel comfortable. I could tell she was comfortable. And then we worked on the problem from there. But that was a great example of both humility and empowerment. And let's work together on this.
That also, I love that. And that also brings to the idea that asking the person, a big part of what we do when we're assessing an individual for communication is interview and observation. And that's a very important part, respecting the response I get when I talk with a child's parents or a person who's had a stroke, their family members, about, what's important and what they were like before or what they're like in other contexts. Understanding that they are just as much of an expert as I am in that person, in that individual. Or Elizabeth, in your case, it was asking you yourself. And a lot of the people with communication impairments that we interact with will be able to communicate for themselves, that sort of emphasis. So remembering that expert nature of the person you're talking with, not disregarding them because I'm the one with the education. So that's an excellent example. Thank you for bringing that up. I want to just make a quick reference to the idea of implicit bias, because that's what goes into a lot of our accidental ableism. The idea that I don't understand where my biases are. I don't know what biases I have. Therefore, that can leak out in what I'm saying. It can leak out in a lot of ways I'm interacting with the individual. It's very similar to the implicit bias we consider in terms of race and ethnicity and body image and all kinds of other factors. Disability is also one of those dimensions that we can measure implicit bias on. And I have the link here to the Harvard implicit bias tests, because we can assess our bias on any number of these dimensions. It addresses many of those. And disability is one of those dimensions that we can measure on. So I would encourage anybody to follow this link and go to follow through and take some of those Harvard implicit bias tests on any dimensions of interest. Again, it includes disability, and you may be surprised at the results you get when you take that in terms of your views related to disability. Even if you think you're not biased, you may find that you have a bias you don't even know about. So related to that as well, I want to consider the idea of how does our attitude impact that ableism? Do I perceive different disabilities differently? We actually find that individuals with disabilities do rank, and treat other people with other disabilities differently. So when we are able and we perceive different disabilities, it does play a role. We may perceive the individual with speech and language disability as different. It's not really a disability like blindness or deafness or mobility. Do we see that differently? And does that affect how we interact? Do I see developmental language disorder differently than autism spectrum disorder? So I may consider that impact. So do I see speech disorder as a disability? Do I see a language disorder as a disability? Is deafness a disability? How do I see these? Are they different to me, or are they equal in terms of that impact? That makes a difference. Obviously, the characteristics are different, but is the innate nature of that disability the same or different to me? What about disabilities that are co-occurring? We've already touched on blindness and ADHD. We could talk about communication impairments with a variety of other disabilities as well. How do I see that versus just the developmental language disorder, just the aphasia? What strengths and motivations are important? We can go back to the idea of Elizabeth's, motivation related to her speech not being. It wasn't a motivation until her love of language became a role. Elizabeth, you also had talked about vision as your weakest link, and we want to consider that strength.
My battery was running low, so I had to run off for a moment and plug in my computer. But I think
is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes. So actually, I was thinking about this, and I'm going to tell a story about it. First of all, where I really feel, again, the living in a world not built for me, or not with the assumptions that I would have inhabiting my body and mind. I feel it very keenly when I've gone into job interviews. As a rule, I do not disclose my disability on a job interview unless there's a reason that I think the person will find out about it without my telling them. So when I go into a room with HR and the interviewers, I can always tell the first thing they see isn't my suit or my jewelry or my tall, slim build. It's my white cane. Because when I go in, I don't hide. And I can immediately tell by the atmosphere, there's usually something between shock and dismay. And I can tell by the level of questions people ask, kind of what reaction they're having to that. But the story I'd like to tell related to the idea of this weakest link idea, and I'll just parenthetically add, it's been a hard thing for me to adapt to the concept of disability pride. I'm not against it at all, but my response initially to that, which is sort of in flux now, but my response was, well, why would I be proud of being born a woman, or being proud of being born an American or into an educated family? Or why would I be proud by the same token of being born with a disability? But when I was, again, right around the time when I mainstreamed into my school, so shortly after that police escort walk, I would walk on the way to my school to and from by a hospital. And at that time, it was a Catholic hospital, and there was this lovely older woman who worked at the front desk who was a nun, a Catholic sister. And somehow, I don't remember how we got to know each other, but she always welcomed me to stop by and say hello to her when I would come by. So maybe every month or so, I don't know how often, I would stop, and she would be addressing envelopes and such, and she would have me seal the envelopes or fold the papers, the cards to go in. And I felt really good about that, that she had me doing something while we would be talking. And that was great until the issue would come up where someone would come up to the desk. And she always would introduce, oh, this is my little blind friend, Elizabeth. And that just, even though I was 8 or 9 years old, maybe 7 years old, that really grated on me. I remember talking to my mother about it, saying, you know, this is a Catholic sister. I don't want to offend her, but I really feel hurt when she says that. And my mother said, just be honest with her. So the next time I saw her, I said, Sister Rose, can I just be your friend? Can you just introduce me as your friend? And I remember she was really quiet. And the next time someone came by, she just said, this is my friend, Elizabeth. And my heart lit up. I said, I'm her friend. I don't have to be little and I don't have to be blind. I can just be her friend. And I felt like that weakest link aspect just vanished, and that we were friends at a different level at that point. And until her dying day, she ended up leaving that hospital and going to a home in Kentucky for Catholic sisters. We corresponded, we called on the phone, and when she passed away, they called me. And I still just have such a fond memory of that friendship. That was probably the first advocacy I ever did, but I became not her little blind friend, but her friend. And I hope on the jobs that I've done, I hope I wasn't that amazing blind employee. I hope I was just an amazing employee, or maybe just an employee.
Excellent. But again, that's a nice example. Had no idea she was, isolating it, you segregating you like that, when she could have been much more inclusive, and you allowed her the opportunity to include you more effectively. And that's wonderful. And that's why, risk, empowerment provides that opportunity to break down those barriers. That barrier would have stayed had you not been empowered to say something.
But it was very scary. It really was a risk.
Absolutely. A lot of the things that I want to encourage with this presentation is taking those scary risks on everybody's part, being a little scared once in a while. Absolutely. So there we go. That's a nice example, motivation and strength, being able to speak up for yourself. That's, taking away that weakest link and focusing on the strength that's there, the inclusion. So, another asset, that's attitude. Setting makes a difference for our ableism as well. am I judging the person to be disabled just because of where we are? If I'm sitting in a hospital doing my job at a hospital, that is going to add the bias towards a medical model. That's going to be add the bias of, cure and, helplessness. That's going to, can I overcome that? Can I get past that setting biasing us and provide the more empowered opportunity, the more inclusive opportunity? So is that making a difference for what I'm doing in a school setting? Is that classroom expectation dictating what I'm doing? Or can I keep in mind that individual child's needs and make this classroom adjust to that? What approach can I take? Am I including ableism? Am I perpetuating ableism by letting that institution, that setting, determine what we're doing? Is the building itself making a difference? Does the child have to, have certain abilities to find the classroom, to find a lunchroom? If the individual's an adult in a setting, do they have to have certain abilities to manipulate the building itself? How much is that potentially disabling? How do other people on the team, whether it's colleagues, therapy colleagues, whether it's medical professionals, whether it's other support staff, whether it's family, whether it's peers, how do they view the person? Is that adding to the disability? Is that making it a challenge? How can I address that? How can I reduce the ableism in the setting itself, whether it's physical building or it's individuals on the team? How much can we do that? How can I work within the cultural differences? If I have somebody who has a different cultural viewpoint that is at odds with my viewpoint related to autonomy, how can I work with that? How can we adjust that to reduce that effect of ableism on the individual? So these are some things we need to consider as well, not just us, but where we are. Individual preferences. How can I incorporate that person's preferences? That person sitting across from me, sitting with me. How can I help encourage their autonomy? How can I encourage them to make those choices for themselves? How can I encourage Elizabeth to speak up and say, can you stop calling me your blind friend? You just call me your friend? How can I encourage that? How can I encourage self-determination, especially in children, to know who they are? But again, at all stages, know who they are, know what they need, know how to speak up for themselves. How can I support that to mitigate the impact of ableism? How can I improve the society outside of my specific interaction to make it better for the individual as well? So these are all things that we can consider, these bigger pictures along with the goals we're setting for the individual. So how do I make it better? This is where we are. This is what we're dealing with. What are some things we can do to make sure we are doing the right thing, that we're advocating, that we're doing with what we need to do to move away from medical models that we're all based on, that all of our professions are based on, and move it towards that social model, which is more respectful and more accepting and inclusive. So at this point, Elizabeth, you had this wonderful story about your thinking cap. And you don't know this, but I added a couple pictures to this slide with a dunce cap and ancient Greek laurels or Roman laurels.
Oh, lovely. Oh, I love that.
How about you share your story with us?
Absolutely. So I promised you earlier we would talk a little bit more about the word handicap. And that was, again, when I was growing up, that was the word that was almost always used, at least in common speech and in my IEPs, etc. It was a big concept to me as a little child to understand that sighted people could know so much that I didn't know immediately. And that I was always, I grew up with the feeling of always being watched, which wasn't true. Maybe I wasn't being spied on, but sighted people simply can't help what they see. And if I'm walking by with a white cane or if I'm doing something, they're going to know it simply because they see it. And I had a far less kind picture of the word handicap than I think the dunce cap may represent. I had a very vivid image that I literally, and kids think very concrete operational. I literally saw my head with this horrible black little round cap on my head. That was my handicap. And the way I pictured this horrible cap was sprouting out with the kind of mold, black mold that you see on bread. It was fuzzy, it was stinky, it was something I didn't want on my head, but it was something that all the sighted people saw on my head was this handicap. And I hated it. I knew it was, I felt like I could never get away from it, never get away from it. And it was humiliating, it was frustrating. Again, that very lovely exception was when Sister Rose started calling me her friend. I felt like it came off then. But I had a teacher in, uh, she would have been in second grade, and she used the phrase to all of us. This was still when I was in the class of the children with visual impairment. She would say, "Now, all of you, I want you to put on your thinking caps." And I knew that I was a good student and I loved to learn. And in my, again, very concrete operational mind, I literally remember in my mind taking off that horrible, moldy, stinky black cap, throwing it off, and putting on, yes, I like the laurel wreath. I probably didn't know about laurel wreaths as much then, but having a beautiful, soft, bright cap that I would put on, that was my thinking cap. And I knew when I used my thinking cap, I would always get the answer right. I was usually the first one to reply, and I would win. And using that image for myself from handicap to thinking cap was just such a powerful way. Again, very early advocacy, but the way a kid would think. They're both caps, right? But they're caps that can be so um, contradictory of each other, and putting that on. And maybe if you have a kid, you might even want to get a little cap, have them wear it, and invite them to put on their little thinking cap to have a little bit of fun with them. And uh, that was certainly something no one ever physically did to me, but boy, mentally, it made all the difference in the world. So just encouraging that. And thanks for the cool graphic.
Well, I didn't want you to feel the need to put on actual caps, so I
Thank
thought
you.
this might be a nice substitute.
Be a bad hair day if I put on that handicap.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's a I think it's just a nice illustration of how even if we don't intend, we don't think about that, a child or somebody with altered cognitive status of any kind can interpret it differently. We know we work with individuals who have challenges with abstract thinking. And so that can be internalized as a very concrete concept. And that can make all the difference in the world. So being careful with what we say is really important for that individual. So also moving forward, I was thinking about this in terms of universal design. Universal design is a really nice concept of making the world accessible to everybody. So we don't have to make accommodations. We don't have to make adjustments for somebody with a different sort of an ability or an impairment or anything. We can try to set things up so it's accessible to everybody across the board. And we usually think about universal design in terms of structures. But we can also apply this to what we do in terms of therapy and attitudes as well. And I'm proposing some ways that we could interpret the 7 different principles related to universal design and apply them to what we do and those interactions we want to foster. The first principle of universal design is equitable use. The idea of this is making sure that everybody can use whatever we're talking about in an equitable way. So this is basically, am I giving all my clients equitable services? Am I treating everybody with the same default expectation of learning and providing services suitable for that expectation? Am I treating my developmentally disabled children as different and less without realizing it, and therefore giving them less services? We do not want to do that. We want to make sure it's equitable. Everybody has the same expectation of the ability to learn the skills they need. In an adult, am I looking at that individual differently based on the amount of impact of whatever caused the impairment? Am I truly equitable with everybody? That's the first principle. That the way we may apply equitable use to our services or what we're doing with individuals, or interactions, I should say. Principle 2, flexibility. I call back risk. We've talked extensively about risk. allowing the person to take the risk, being flexible in what I'm providing to the individual in terms of resources, so that they can, use that and take that chance and adjust, find out what consequences there might be and make their own adjustment to that. And am I doing what the person really needs? So how am I providing what they need? I mean, it could be something as simple as, if I want to improve somebody's ability to control and strengthen the muscles in their mouth, am I doing oral motor exercises, which is, potentially useful, but am I making it more, being flexible in terms of making it more functional for them? Are they doing oral hygiene? Are we working with oral strengthening through oral hygiene, things like that? Instead of just naming pictures, am I putting it in context? Maybe creating a game and making it into a game or a functional activity. Maybe working with an occupational therapist to make it functional. Can you identify things in the kitchen? How am I getting that, reaching that? What strategy am I using? Flexibility in adjusting how I do it. So principle 3 of universal design, simple, intuitive use. I think this one is probably pretty intuitive for speech pathologists. We all learn, setting their goals at the right level. So it's challenging, but not too challenging. Is it natural for the person to be doing this? The intuitive part might not be quite as natural for us to come up with. Is it something, again, motivating for the person? Is it intuitive that they care about this? This is what they want to do. And how does this interact with the family? Can the family help with this? And we're all team members. We're all equal. How can they play a role in helping this? And is this important to the family as well? So, simple and intuitive use, fairly straightforward for speech pathologists. But remember, consider, how this impacts us. Perceptible information. How accessible am I really being? Okay. Am I using materials that I can, that the person can relate to? Elizabeth, if I gave you pictures to name, how would you do with that?
Not so well without a good description.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I want to make sure I'm using the right thing. And am I being really accessible as an individual, not just materials? Elizabeth, do you feel open with talking with me? Am I encouraging your input? Am I encouraging you to advocate for yourself? So is it perceptible? Do you know that I'm open to that? These are things that we need to consider. Again, this is a more of a mindful approach. Am I actively encouraging that? Or am I assuming that you just have to figure it out? I want to be very clear that, you've got you could speak to me, you can tell me your preferences. It's really important. Okay. This should be just a natural progression. This is just something we are taught in school. So this is, it's just taking it that next step to me being as open as what I'm using. Okay. Tolerance for error. How strict am I when I'm talking about correct? I mean, is it close enough? Is that lift good enough? Or do I need to correct it? I know some of us were really strict. It has to be exactly right or we won't move on. Is that really what matters? Does the R have to be close enough for the child to be able to tell the teacher what they want? Or does the sentence structure have to be exactly right? Or is it going to communicate effectively without being exactly right? This is also a really, really good principle to adopt advocacy under. So, if I'm looking at the individual and, I think that you're communicating pretty effectively, how can I help the other professionals or the family members appreciate that this works? You understand what they're saying, right? And is that good enough? So tolerance for error is a nice opportunity for me to advocate. Okay. So, we've got lots of opportunities to help other people move ahead in their interactions with the individual. So, allowing them to be more accepting of errors is really important. So we can take universal design to our advocacy as well. The sixth principle, low physical effort. How hard am I making the person work? this is the same idea, and we could take the same idea for the principle 3, the simple and intuitive. So am I doing this at an appropriate level? Is this and we should know this. We are taught this in school. Principle 7, the last principle of universal design, size and space for approach and use. Again, we think about this more in terms of the physical space, but we can apply this to what we're doing as well. Being flexible, principle 2, flexible in my approach. Should I be working with you in a therapy room or in their natural setting, in the classroom, in their own home, in a community environment? How much, what's appropriate for me to be working with you? It's a universal design to work with people where it's natural for them, right? And it's easier to generalize. And Elizabeth, I know this is really more specific to speech pathology and less to the language that your strength is in. But do you have any other thoughts with that?
Well, I would just say that, and even when we're talking about error, the word error, I would even say, how wide are the margins?
Excellent.
If you go back to the idea of the R, the pronunciation of the R, if someone's goal is to be a radio announcer or a linguist, they'd better get that R the way that native speakers normally pronounce that R. If they want to communicate, how important is it? Again, but I kind of like the idea of, maybe there's this little center ideal that we have, which is fine. And then again, how much are we willing or able to widen that, and not to be afraid to have the person work hard. I mean, it is hard work. I can tell you, it is hard work to change a speech habit. It's really hard work. But how important is it, and how do we want to widen that or narrow it, depending on what that person is doing and wanting to do. And
Takes us back.
If that R pronunciation is leading to bullying, for example, it might be really important to that person to learn to make it in such a way that that bullying stops with the R. Now, of course, I can guarantee you the bullying will go to something else. But again, that whole motivational idea and what the person's idea is of what they really want to do and where they want to.
Absolutely. To going back to the input, the autonomy of the person, let them determine what's important and adjust our range of acceptable based on that priority. So that person gets to decide what is good enough based on their needs, their social, their aspirational needs. Absolutely. Excellent. So that's the 7 principles and universal design. Like I said, we usually don't think of this into context of speech and language, but it's applicable. It can help tailor our approach. It can help make our approach more inclusive to the individual if we think of it in this context as well. Different ways that we can look at it, whatever works for us to help make it easier for us to remember where to center our attention, where to center the priorities.
And let me just tell a little story in relation to that. The first principle, can everybody use it, is such a cool principle. And that is, the heart and soul of universal design. But I had the opportunity in the 1990s to live in Siberia, so kind of Central Eastern Russia. And I was working with a group of people who use wheelchairs. And a goal that they had was to get some curb cuts and ramps so that they could go out and, go to the market, go to places in the city. And when they first went to City Hall in a city about the size of Columbus with that demand, ironically, the response of the administrators was, well, you're not going out, so why do you need it? And of course, the response was, we're not going out because we don't have it and we can't get out. But they went back and forth on that, back and forth. And finally, particularly around the central marketplace, where they did not have curb cuts either, they used the argument, there are a lot of women and men who have baby carriages. There are a lot of people who buy from the market who take wheeled carts or who could take wheeled carts. And you know how much this would help everybody to have this kind of ramp or curb cut? And within a matter of a couple of weeks, the City Hall agreed and they made curb cuts in some of those areas, and even in the center of town, saying, well, we have people with strollers, and we have people with cars. Oh yes, and also people with wheelchairs who are are using these now, and they're getting out. And it really made the difference between access and non-access for people who were not able to walk on their own 2 feet. So again, just a great example of universal design and the persuasiveness that you sometimes need to say this is good for everybody. And whether it's speech, or whether it's eye contact, or whether it's my friend saying my friend, whether it's finding that motivation and finding what works for everyone. It's not always easy. When you cut to the bedrock and you're able to do that, it can be so empowering for yourselves as professionals and for the people, the human beings that you're working with.
Absolutely. And that's a nice echo of, the value of curb cuts here and all those physical structures that we rely on so much. A nice illustration of how, if you make the access available for everybody, then it's good for everybody. Absolutely. So we're getting close to wrapping up. So I want to kind of just review some things. Assessing what is truly necessary is important. Cut out the things that the person doesn't actually need. Focus on what they really need based on their desires, their motivations. What do they really need to be able to do? And what abilities do we see that we can work with the client in developing? So maybe it's a less traditional strength, but we can encourage that as a strength that they can then have as their best link to counterbalance, perhaps, maybe if they don't meet typical standards in another area that they don't care about so much. So focusing on what's really, really necessary, not what we just initially think is necessary, is really important with us here. Who's really an expert? Medical model, we talk about the professionals, the trained experts as the expert. We want to consider in looking at the social model when we're interacting with people, the family, the social peers, the individual is an expert. We are experts as well, but we're also assistants. We're not the leader. We are only part of a team. And that requires professional humility. We have to be able to acknowledge that, yes, you, I know a topic area, you, we need to work together for those needs, those priorities. We need to do this as a true team. So that takes humility to be able to do that. We need to keep that in mind. Intersections, we've talked about intersectionality briefly. We want to make sure we're considering accessibility on all the dimensions that are relevant to that individual, not just speech and language, every aspect. What do we need to consider in that person in terms of aspirations, in terms of physical differences, in terms of all kinds of things that we may not initially think about? We need to consider all aspects of that individual. And the last thing I want to introduce new here is the idea of social stories and rehearsal opportunities. For a lot of individuals we interact with, knowing what to expect makes a big difference in our ability to be included in a situation. We're used to, clinically, in our training, we're used to rehearsal opportunities. We're used to giving a person an opportunity to try their communication in different settings and different situations. We can extend that to social stories where a company, a physical location may have a booklet that explains what to expect that the person can look at before arriving. Dentists' offices can have such a thing. Some kind of a store or market could have a social story where they know what to expect when they go in, what kinds of crowds and sounds and experiences they might deal with. The airport in Columbus has the social story available for people to know what to expect if they're traveling. So we can encourage different companies, different locations. We can encourage our employer to create social stories, to give people an opportunity to know what to expect before going into a situation. So we have a lot of opportunities that we can advocate for additional opportunities. Any last thoughts, Elizabeth?
I would just say creativity plays a great part in that. And I know sometimes with myself or working with younger people that I've mentored, literally that role play can be such a powerful tool. And, maybe even playing a few different scenarios, it really can help build someone's self-confidence and to talk through it afterwards. If something didn't succeed, why didn't it? What can I do next time to make it more successful? And to realize that it doesn't depend totally on the person that you're working with your client. It also, you know, you are in the world, there are going to be different people. I often say, the bank is as good as the teller who greets you, and realizing that there are going to be always different reactions to our disabilities. I mean, as long as I live, there will probably be waiters or waitresses who look to a sighted person I'm with and who will say, what does she want to eat? But there are also people who will then just say, I don't know, I guess you'd better ask her. So it's just accepting, the fact that all these margins come into our community from the disability perspective as well. And we have to sort of widen our margins to accept the sometimes prevalence of not understanding where we're coming from, but still trying. And our efforts are going to be what keeps us going along, both for you as the professionals and we as your partners in service.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we at the end of our 2 hours. So I am just going to share the references that I included in creating this presentation, along with Elizabeth's wonderful background and experience, and my own background and experience as well. Here's the contact information for both of us. You can email either of us at any point if you have any kind of questions or want to follow up on anything that we touched on and didn't go into as deeply as you would like. And finally, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you benefited from our insights and our experiences and can take this with you into your next sessions.